Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm very excited to welcome you to the third session in our Culture Change Roadmap webinar series. Today's session will focus on people leaders driving optimal results. I'm Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's Director of Digital Marketing, and today I'm joined by several other members of the Denison team, Dave Kirchoff, President and Senior Consultant, Valerie Thomas, VP of Consulting Services, Meredith Grib, Associate Consultant, and Margaret Gorman, VP of Sales and Marketing. Before I briefly overview our firm and introduce the team further and turn things over to them, I'd like to encourage you all to utilize the chat and Q&A features below. Please test the functionality by sharing where in the world you are joining us from. Our team will monitor your comments and questions and will post to our speakers at the end of their discussion during Q&A. While many of you are likely familiar with Denison, I'd like to now give a brief overview of the firm and what we do. Denison Consulting is a firm focused on large-scale culture transformation and leadership development, headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with a European office based outside of Zurich, Switzerland. With over 20 years of experience and 10,000 clients to date, our global reach has allowed us to do work in over 50 countries and to develop world-class research and diagnostics. I'd like to now introduce today's speakers. Meredith Grib is a member of our consulting and client success management teams. She joined the Denison team after working internationally as a buyer in the automotive industry. With a passion for coaching and creating effective processes and teams, she works to support clients as they work through their unique culture transformations. Valerie Thomas is Denison's VP of Consulting Services. She has over 20 years of experience working for Fortune 100 companies in HR and organizational development. Her experience managing large-scale change initiatives, coupled with her leadership coaching and performance management expertise, contributes to her success in leading companies through their culture transformation efforts. Dave Kirchoff is an expert in large-scale change initiatives, manufacturing and operational excellence, and procurement. His focus at Denison is helping clients with organizational integration, change management, leadership, cross-functional coordination and collaboration, innovation, and teamwork. Dave joined Denison as Vice President in 2014 after 33 years of executive experience with a top-tier global consumer product organization. In 2019, he transitioned to President. I'd like to now turn things over to Meredith to get things started. Before I do that, though, I did want to remind you all, please submit questions and comments throughout, and our team will monitor. But over to you, Meredith.
Thank you, Nellie. Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So to kick us off, we're going to first talk about just the impact of leadership development and why is it important. So culture and leadership, something that we say often, if you speak to anyone at Denison, is culture and leadership are two sides of the same coin. They walk hand in hand. And often, and the reason why we say this is because our model for both culture and leadership is the same. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. As discussed in the last webinar, if you haven't had a chance to listen to the last webinar with Raul and Jay, two members of my team, they discussed that leaders impact retention, and that is so true, but also they impact so much more, including commitment, engagement, safety, trust. At the center of our model for both culture and leadership, and the basis of culture is based on perceptions, beliefs, and assumptions. So we want to understand what are those collective perceptions of your leadership and of your leaders, and also of the organization as a whole. And it's helpful to understand, what those perceptions are, because as specifically for a leader, just because you have a skill or a leadership strength, it doesn't mean that it's always necessarily visible to the other people you're working with. And understanding that maybe one of your strengths is not visible can help you understand some adjustments that you may need to make, or potential development opportunities for your team to be more effective and to impact the culture more. And at my last point, to impact the organizational culture and drive sustainable change. Individual leaders make up your leadership teams, and it's important to develop your executive teams down to the individual level to have the greatest impact on your culture, to drive sustainable change, to drive results forward. It's important to give your leadership tools to succeed and create consistency and efficiency overall. As we go into the next slide, I just want to do a brief explanation of our model. So we'll be looking at the model right now, specifically from a leadership perspective. So our model is made up of 4 key traits, and these traits are mission, consistency, involvement, and adaptability. And as we look at the mission part of our model, it's looking at, as a leader, are you helping your employees understand what they are expected to do and why? Is the mission of the organization clear? And is there a visible line of sight between the near-term and long-term priorities? Do you have goal tracking mechanisms in place? Do employees see how those goals relate to their specific roles? And then do employees have a sense of purpose that's combined with a results orientation? As we look into consistency, do you have processes that are consistent and effective in place? Are you able to coordinate effectively across the departments within your organization to eliminate those silos and work across the different boundaries? Are you practicing what you preach? Are you setting clear expectations for behavior that supports consistent decision-making? And are you able to create win-win solutions and allow for constructive conflict and constructive conversations about key issues that come up? For the involvement, are you able to organize work so that it can be accomplished as a team? Do the members of your team feel empowered to make decisions and act with a sense of ownership? And do they have the skills and information needed to be able to execute in their specific roles? And do they see how those roles link back to achieving that long-term vision and mission? And then in adaptability, are you able to create a psychologically safe environment for your team members? Do they understand, and do your employees understand that when they make a mistake, it's not a failure, but it's an opportunity for learning and improvement? And that psychological safe space is a perfect space for innovation. Are you able to create change effectively, transfer knowledge and information effectively across the organization? And do the members of your organization, the members of your team and your employees, do they understand who the customer is, how those customers impact change, how their feedback impacts decision-making processes? And are they able to connect with that customer directly? Dave and Valerie, do you have any comments on that before I continue?
No, actually, I think you did a really good job there, Meredith. I think you covered everything.
Okay, so going to the next slide. It's important to have a structure for development. We often use a 4-point model. Sometimes we use a 5-point model, and I'll explain that in a minute, to develop your leaders. The one that is not currently included in the visual, which would make it more of a 5-point model, would be job shadowing. We typically would encourage to start with job shadowing, and then from there, walking the leader through their 360 report and feedback, and just having them understand and get grounded in that data, in that feedback, and then from there go into development planning and coaching. Dave, I know you've had a lot of experience with the job shadowing, what that looks like, the impact of that. Do you mind walking us through that briefly?
Not at all. Thanks, Meredith. Job shadowing can be a really great way of actually experiencing how a leader behaves in certain situations. So what this entails is actually doing exactly that, is following a leader through their normal day-to-day tasks, attending meetings, going through any areas of concern that they may have from their areas of responsibility. And we get an opportunity to see how they interact with their peers, with their direct reports, with their boss. And that helps us when we sit down and look at the assessments from the 360s. We can relate those assessment data back to some experiences that we actually saw them with that job shadowing. A couple of examples: if we're working with leaders who, have some challenges in working through disagreements, if we're in meetings where we see that happen, that's an opportunity for us to kind of point that out and say, here's what we saw. These may be some other areas you should consider as you're working through disagreements. How they delegate tasks. Are they good at empowerment? Seeing that in action just helps you coach that individual a little better.
Thank you, Dave. And then, so typically, as I mentioned, we'll go from job shadowing to awareness building. So looking at their 360s, getting them grounded in that data. But then from there, we typically go into development planning. And Valerie, do you have any comments on the best things to keep in mind with development planning?
Sure, Meredith. Hello, everyone. I think similar to culture results, you want to take action on 360 data, and we have a pretty easy model for creating a development plan. It's 5 characteristics, keeping it simple and targeted. So what those are, you want to make sure that the leader is identifying specific, difficult, but achievable goals related to what they heard in their feedback. You also want to make sure the leader is focused on a few areas, not trying to fix everything, but really targeting their development on their strategic priorities, as well as being specific and measurable around what they hope to build a stronger muscle in. And there's also areas where it may not need a specific goal related to it. It may just be increased awareness. And that is one of the things as a coach, we often help them understand. Part of this process now, you have increased awareness around how you're showing up within the organization and on your team. So an example of increased awareness might be a habit that a leader has. I'll share a personal one. I tend to interrupt as others are talking. And so you don't create a development goal around my habit of interrupting, but I certainly have increased awareness. And I ask others to support me when I'm dialing too far into that old habit that I'm trying to improve. The other piece of an effective development plan is making sure that it's ongoing. This is a journey that leaders are on, and we want to be trying new behaviors out, new experiences with others, and we need to evaluate how that's going from time to time. And sometimes it takes some readjustment, and new behaviors show up that we want to either lean into more or dial back. And then the other piece of this is making sure it's focused on what they are responsible for and how it ties to the strategic priorities of the organization. And having an effective development plan builds leadership accountability. Hopefully that gives you a sense of our development planning process.
Thank you, Valerie. That was great. So something that we've started to touch on is that a leader has impact on the culture. And if we go into the next slide, we can actually take a look at a specific story and kind of show how that comes into play. So before I get into that, just a brief explanation so you can have some understanding of the different colors and numbers, what all of that means. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see Leadership 360 data. So you'll see self. So that's the leader's self-evaluation of their leadership skills. The combined other is the combined feedback of their boss, their peer, their direct reports, and then people that they have included in other category. And then to the right, we have culture data. So this is showing a 2020 overall culture view. And also the last circumflex on the right is the 2021 overall culture view. So we can show the historical growth over time. Now, as we're looking at these from a leadership perspective, it shows the level of clarity that a leader provides across mission, consistency, involvement, and adaptability. And from a culture perspective, it shows the level of clarity and alignment across mission, consistency, involvement, and adaptability for the organization as a whole. If you see any of these numbers, so if we look at the 87 under mission, goals, and objectives for culture, this means that as an organization, you scored equal to or better than 87% of the organizations within our normative database. So all of the numbers that you see are percentile scores and are linked back to our normative database. More color is better, and we do have benchmarks for both leadership and for culture. More and more leaders are expected to impact and drive the culture. And often we can look at a leader's strengths and see how those can be leveraged to not only improve the culture, but we can also see areas of opportunity that should be developed that are also potentially impacting the culture. In this specific example, I worked very closely with this leader, and she had a very visible role of driving a lot of actions within the organization to improve the culture. And so what you can see after their initial culture survey in 2020, they decided to, as an organization, take their leaders through 360s and also through coaching. And what was awesome to see is that this leader really took an action-oriented mindset with taking the feedback they received from the coaching, but also all of the insights from the culture, and then driving a lot of action in the culture. And then when we did the survey again in 2021, we saw that there was significant growth in all areas of the model as a result. This leader, it's important to know, also had a lot of support from their team, from the other higher up level leadership within the organization, and they were given the tools and development needed to succeed. We can go to the next slide. So not only does a leader have impact on the culture, but the opposite is also true. The culture actually has impact on the effectiveness of the leader. And I think this is something that we don't spend enough time focusing on, and it's not something that's talked about very often. So for this specific example, this leader, he was specifically brought in from one organization. So you can see that the self perspective and evaluation, and then you see this previous combined under the leadership 360 profile. So why we have that, this previous combined other actually shows the leader's previous department that they were leading. And they were specifically brought to a new department as a change agent, and they were brought specifically for their strengths to drive change within the culture of this new department. However, they were not supported by their leadership team. They were not given the development they needed. They were not given the resources they needed. And the culture was not one that actually supported any of the changes that they were trying to make. And you can see in the culture profiles that it was very critical perceptions of the culture, very critical perceptions of the new department. So you see the combined other, that was taken before this leader could really spend a lot of time within that culture. And as a result, unfortunately, this leader ended up leaving the organization before they could receive any further development, and they just weren't given what they would needed to succeed. So a change agent, one that is completely countercultural, can only be successful if they are given the support and tools that they need to actually drive sustainable change forward. Dave, do you have any thoughts on how to best support a leader, how to create a better environment for this? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, the next a couple sets of slides, I think we'll build on that a little bit. I'll give you some examples and some tools that we use to be real thoughtful about the development of a leader and the type of support that they may need ahead of time to hopefully avoid situations that you just mentioned here. So if we go to the next slide. As Meredith mentioned, culture fit is really important. More often than not these days, leaders are being really held accountable for the cultures that they lead. We hear stories about leaders being removed from their posts, their leadership posts, because of cultural issues within the organization. And we know that leaders play that real integral part in shaping the culture of the organization. So it is incredibly important to continually develop the skills of leaders and managers, because we know that will help shape the organizational culture that they lead. So when considering what types of development a leader may need, it's important to understand how they fit within the culture. I think the example that Meredith just walked us through is a really good example to show you that it is very important to really have some thoughtful discussions about that cultural fit. And then understanding the strengths of the individuals, as well as the strengths and opportunities of the departments that they are to lead in the future, will help the HR departments or any leaders, help them develop the appropriate plans to make the success of that individual more likely. So I'll talk through a little bit of some of these tools that we use. And if you go to the next slide, Nellie. This is a tool that we refer to as a leader culture fit framework. And we're going to build this slide here. So what you see off to the right, Meredith already talked a little bit about this. So the profile on the left is the leader's 360 profile. So this is where he or she received that feedback from peers and direct reports and any other important stakeholders within the organization to develop a profile of how that leader is perceived. On the right at the top, you'll see the cultural profile of the department that this leader is eventually going to go, or being considered to go lead this area. So the next part of the tool, if you go to the next slide, thank you, Nellie, is what we try to do is plot or identify not only the leader's challenges and strengths, but also the cultural challenges and strengths. And where those intersect is where you can provide some real thought into how to develop that leader. So we'll build this slide a little bit further. So where we have real strengths in the leader, so up at the top where you see the leader competencies and the strengths are more toward the right, and the culture has challenges, that is an opportunity for a change agent. So for the individual to be able to leverage his strengths to go in there to try to make some real change within the organization. But you need to be aware that this individual, because they're going into a culture that doesn't have real strengths in these areas, will need support. They can be good change agents because of their ability to change, but they will need some support. Now, I'll contrast that with down below where you see the culture has strengths and the leader also has strengths. That may be an opportunity to leverage that situation to optimal success because there's strengths in both of those. Now, let's build the slide a little bit more. So those areas where the leader does not have the strengths and may be challenged in some areas, and if you coincide that with a culture that they're going in to lead that has those similar challenges, that may be, and no pun intended here, but that may be a challenging situation. And you need to be aware of that and what types of support, coaching, mentoring might be necessary to make that leader successful. And then the final area of the model is where the leader has challenges, but the culture has some real strengths. This may be a great opportunity for a leader to go in and learn from the culture of the department that they're going into to learn and develop his or her skills in particular areas. So let's bring this to life a little bit and plot some of the scores that you see above on the grid, the leader cultural fit framework grid. So the next slide, Nellie. So as we think about the fit here with the leader, a leader up to the top left profile that you see, if you look at that mission area, the red section, so that's vision, goals, and strategy, that leader does not have real strengths in these areas. And as you look at the department itself, the department doesn't have real strengths in this areas either. So what this really means is that the leader is struggling with understanding the long-term mission, understanding the goals of the organization. What's the roadmap? What's the strategy for meeting that long-term vision? And the culture of the department is very similar. This individual will be challenged, likely, to make some real change in this area. Okay? Now, if we move to the right, to the coordinate section, or the agent section with coordinate in it, this is an example where the leader has real strengths. The culture is challenged in that area, and this may be an opportunity for the leader to be a real change agent, but he or she will still need a level of support because of the challenges in the culture that they're moving into. Now, as we move into the green section, the develop section, we've listed teamwork as an example here. So you can see over on the right-hand profile up top, that team orientation section of our model is very strong. It's filled out to the 4th quartile. However, when you look at the leader's profile is below average. So this may be an opportunity for a leader to go in and learn from the teamwork practices that are in that department and really develop his or her skills accordingly. And then the final area is that leverage section, and we put the customer in there, customer focus in there as an example of this. Both the leader and the department have real strengths in customer focus. This is an opportunity where you can just leverage this area and really maximize the benefits that you derive from a real strong customer focus within your organization. It's a great tool. It's a great tool. It's a pretty simple tool, but it's also really good to provide the elements for you to really think through your development plans for leaders and managers. Okay. Next slide, Molly. So this is a little bit similar to what Meredith talked about earlier, but we wanted to give you a little bit of information on how these type of development activities can really help and impact your culture. So what we've done with this slide is that on the top part, you'll see 2 profiles, one 2021 culture and the other 2022. What we did with this is we took a look at the above average managers and leaders culture or 360 assessments, and we aggregated those. And then we looked at the cultures that they manage and aggregated those. So what you see off to the left is that the cultures for those above average leaders and managers were pretty strong in 2021. And following the coaching and development work that we did, they remain strong for 2022. Now, if you look down below and we see the 2021 below average aggregation of the leaders and managers, their respective cultural scores, below average in many of those areas, in all but one area. And then following the coaching and development of those groups, those managers, you can see the impact that it had on their respective department cultures. Nice improvement from one year to the next. So the impact that we see from this development work for leaders, it can be very impressive. I know that we've been talking a lot about individual leader development and coaching, and I think Valerie, you probably have some thoughts here about how we can do more teamwork type of development.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dave. So we're a big fan at Denison of connecting dots. And part of, as Dave and Meredith have talked a lot about, coaching individual leaders and helping them shape their cultures, we use our 360-degree feedback, both from an individual perspective, but also in building high effective teams. And so we can take a team of leaders through who have participated in our 360 and aggregate their data to identify the common strengths and the challenges across that leadership team. And that data helps us facilitate team development exercises and really tries to help focus that team on the bigger impact that team is having, as well as clarify the impact the leaders and leadership teams have on culture. So kind of building a connected tissue between leadership, culture, and team development, if you will. And the next slide, you've seen a lot of profiles here today. We could all probably talk about each of these for hours, but we're trying to give you a good picture of kind of the work that we do with culture, leadership, and teams. So what you're seeing here is that composite report. So we had 7 leaders within an organization take the 360, and we compiled all of their data. And this was our starting point to really define how they show up currently in terms of their teamwork and how they're being perceived by others in enabling teamwork within the organization. So from a self profile, you see pretty high scores, above average in most of the profile there. So a lot of experience, probably demonstrated strength from an individual perspective. But then when you look at the combined other, which is all of the raters these 7 folks had contribute to their 360, you see a little bit more critical view. And as you go through the different profiles, the peer profile tends to be the most critical, which is fairly common. Those of you who do coaching probably know this. Our peers tend to be our toughest critics for a number of reasons. But for this group of 7, we worked from that peer profile specifically in terms of how they're showing up on the team. The good news for these 7 folks is they've spent a lot of energy and a lot of their time probably focused on their own direct reports and building their teams. And that is reflected here in their direct report profile. So what we were trying to do is help them understand, how do we spend as much energy, if not more energy, kind of building our peer network and having a broader impact on the organization, the culture, and the effectiveness of teamwork. So oftentimes when we're looking and helping leaders think through individual and team profiles, we ask them, how visible are you demonstrating these strengths? And in some of these rater groups, you have more visibility in some of the areas of the model. So we often say your boss has the best view of you demonstrating the characteristics in mission. Direct reports have the best view of a leader demonstrating the competencies within involvement, and our peers have the best view in terms of consistency. And, you know, if you think about it, most leaders are working collaboratively, having to work across functional boundaries. That coordination and integration shows up a lot with their peers, as well as being able to reach agreement and come to consensus on difficult issues. So when we worked with this team, we really focused on that peer profile. So if we go to the next slide, Nellie, it'll show a little bit more in terms of the work that we were doing with them. So again, pretty critical view of one another. There was a little unhealthy competition. So the structure that was in place for them to be able to work across the organization, they had to build that. The organization culturally was more of a siloed approach. And so this team was kind of operating in that environment. And we had to build, how do we want to coordinate? How do we want to kind of build the team effort from a peer-based? Again, most of these individuals maybe interacted monthly with one another, or maybe in a crisis mode, they were solving problems together, but they didn't have a natural habit or an operating rhythm of how do we start to build stronger peer relationships. So we created that. And the next piece of this is the culture impact, right? So looking at the culture, as Dave and Meredith both said, leaders have impact on cultures, teams have impact on culture. So you can see this culture profile suggests that coordination and integration is not a habit. We definitely have some silo activity. Team orientation also suffers within the culture. So kind of enabling and building more teamwork and modeling that at a peer perspective to get more strength within the culture is critically important. So some of the activities, as you build the slide, Nellie, for me, you know, we were trying to optimize their results. So this organization was seeing a dip in their financial results, also in their operating performance. And this team had a lot of responsibility, this set of peers, in their operating performance in particular. So we wanted to work with them to kind of figure out what are those peer dynamics, how do we start to build stronger connection points with each other, define what does a cohesive team look like, what are those behaviors, so getting at the behavior level, and then rating, how well are we doing? Do we do this behavior often, not often, rarely? And then we had to create some commitments. So part of this process is aligning around the definition of how we're going to be playing on a bigger, broader team, but also thinking through the individual and team commitments as well. And then the biggest aspect of a lot of the work that we're doing there is helping leaders be more visible, being more mindful and cognizant, and again, connecting those dots. So when we're thinking through the cultural lens, we want to start to build that visibility and help others model and support each other along the way. So still work to be done here, but they're anticipating another culture survey here. So I'm looking forward to seeing the impact these leaders are having as a higher performing team together from a peer perspective. And then the next slide here, as I kind of close, one of the things that we always tell our clients to be focused on action. When you have data, whether it's culture, 360, you need to take action on it. But that action needs to be aligned with your business priorities. So making sure that you are focused on the top business priorities, the business challenges, the things that the organization's trying to accomplish, and then taking a look at both from a culture data perspective, as well as your 360 and team profile. What are some of the strengths? And Nellie, you can go ahead and build here the strengths that we see that positions the organization for success, the team for success, and the individual for success that we want to maintain and build. And what in the culture data might be a barrier. Again, for the example I shared, silo activity was definitely a barrier in terms of their operating performance. And then looking at the 360 data, both from an individual perspective and also from that team perspective, and looking for where you're positioned well and where may be some potential barriers, and then creating a development plan, team plan that's focused on those priorities and making sure that we're closing the gap in terms of the areas of development that is needed for the culture and for the leaders. Dave, Meredith, anything to add here? I know we talked about both culture and leadership. Anything from an action perspective?
I think your point.
No, I think you covered it.
Sorry, Dave.
Sorry,
I was going to
Meredith,
say, I think your point about creating the structures is so important and so key, especially back to your last example, because if we're looking at, if you are not able to create consistency as a leadership team, then you're not able to create alignment throughout your cultures, because each of those leaders has their own departments, has their own style, has all the things they're communicating. But if that's not consistent with the rest of their team and they don't have the structures of support to build that consistency in place, then you won't have alignment as a culture, and you won't be effective as a team overall. So I really loved your point about that.
Oh, thank you, Meredith. And, it makes me think of the exercise that we do with teams around give and get. So making sure that we're aligned around what each of the departments, function areas need to give one another, and what do they need to get from one another. So we do that from a cultural perspective, but also from a team perspective. So really trying to build a stronger muscle in that coordination and integration and alignment around the goals as well. So the next slide,
Valerie, that spurred another thought from my perspective too. I think one of the things to really consider here is when you get to the action point, it's really important to ensure that you've got really good governance around those actions, so that you are measuring them, you're delivering against them. Because if you're good at developing actions but not good at executing them, you're not going to get that far. So the governance around that is really important.
the governance, and that sets us up for the implementation of these actions, right? And the sustainable future. Yep. Thank you. So our hope over the next slide here is we're hoping that as you walk away here, that you have some key takeaways. So our hope is that we've drove these points home throughout the time that we've been together. The first one there, leaders impact culture and culture impacts leaders. So all three of us kind of talked about and gave stories around that, and hopefully that has become even clearer for all of you. And optimizing results takes focused action, both at the individual level, the team level, and the organizational level. And tying that action to the strategic priorities is critically important. And, Meredith shared a leader that didn't get the level of support that was needed and didn't get the development and resources to be successful. So we hope that we drove home the point of making sure that there's the right level of support and resources given to both individuals as well as teams. And then aligning that data from a culture and a 360 assessment to the strategy. Again, for optimal results, sustainable results, it has to be focused on what you're trying to achieve, your vision and your strategy. So thank you very much for allowing us the time to kind of share some of our stories and working with organizations from a culture perspective and a leadership perspective.
Dave and Meredith, do you have any closing thoughts before we start answering some questions from our participants?
No, actually, from my perspective, I'm interested to see what type of questions we're going to get. So,
yeah,
looking forward to that.
Likewise.
Sounds good. We have gotten a lot of questions, so let me just look through. Margaret, do you have any top of mind while I take a peek through? I know we've gotten a good number.
Yeah, no, here's a really interesting one is around working with clients and cross-functional change agents. Have you used the tool with those cross-functional change agents as well?
The cultural tool or the
Leadership 360.
Yeah, Leadership 360. We have. As you think about organizations, particularly large organizations that are more matrixed and pretty dispersed, the importance of being able to collaborate and coordinate across those groups is really important. So when you think about the cultural tool, as we segment the data, we're able to look at culture from the entire organization, but also from each of the individual segments. So when we speak of segments, it can be departments. So you can think of procurement, engineering, quality. And as we look at how those groups answered some of those questions, we can clearly get to a point where we may be able to say, you know what, your ability to coordinate across those different areas is not that strong. So let's dig a little bit deeper to find out what we can do to build up that eliminate the silos and build up that coordination and integration. And there is where you can find some leaders that have real strength in those areas to help develop those areas to be stronger at that coordination and integration. From a team perspective, we can put various groups together and do exercises like Valerie mentioned, like the give-get sessions. So that's really important when an organization has developed its strategy or vision going forward, for those cross-functional teams to get together and to say, okay, now that we know what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish as an organization, what do we need from each other to make that happen? What do we need to give to each other to make that happen? So the tools can be used in a variety of ways, and they're really, really effective.
There was another one here, and it kind of blends with two of them. Someone was saying they're familiar with Bass's MLQ, and then another participant asked about the leadership scales, like what are they based on, and so maybe a little bit of background about how this evolved from the culture survey might be helpful, or how it's different than other leadership tools.
I can take that unless Valerie, you or Meredith want it.
go ahead, Dave. I'll jump in after you.
So a little bit how the Leadership 360 came to be. Our founder, Dan Denison, worked in trying to identify and successfully identifying and creating a model that really measured organizational performance from a cultural perspective. When he launched that, it was hugely successful. And then shortly after that, a lot of folks were looking at Dan and saying, hey, this is great, but we also know that leaders have an impact on culture. Can you create something that helps us identify the leader's impact on culture as well? And that's how the leadership model became to be. Dan said, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense, and went out and created it. And while he modeled it after the cultural model, there are very distinct differences. All the questions are framed through a leadership lens, and there are more questions that are asked, or more items that the respondents are asked to reply to for the leadership model. One of the theories behind that is, it's not often that leaders get a lot of feedback. So when we do provide feedback, this assessment is a really, really robust way for leaders to see how they're being perceived from a 360 perspective. So that's how that model came to be.
I think the model is helpful as well from both a culture perspective, but also a leadership perspective, because it provides teams and organizations with the language, a common language, which helps create that consistency. And it actually gives you a framework to have those conversations, whether it be about development or whether it be about the culture of your organization. It really helps provide a common language for that can really help create some effectiveness as a leadership team and build upon that muscle.
Yeah, and I think that's also important from a leader perspective. I think that's a great point, Meredith. A leader can not only see how they're being perceived from their own 360, but they also have an opportunity to see the impact of those perceptions on the areas that they lead, which is hugely important.
Yeah, and it gives them an opportunity to be curious around how do we create different experiences. We often say that these perceptions, you don't have to agree or disagree with them, but you do need to manage them, right? In terms of those perceptions that are help driving the culture forward. So the choice is, how do we create different experiences, be more visible, demonstrating those competencies as leaders, as teams, and as a culture.
Here's another good question. Any thoughts on organizational culture where formal or facilitated informal mentoring is used compared to organizations that don't place emphasis on mentoring?
I'm not sure if the question is, do we have metrics on that? And if that's the question, I'm not sure that we do or don't. I'd have to connect with the team internally to see what kind of metrics we have on that. But we study organizations, again, all over the world, and mentoring, whether it's internal or informal or formal process, mentoring is highly recommended. We do also recommend that it's very thoughtful, that you do think through the types of mentoring, coaching, support that you are providing individuals. The tools that we showed you today will help you with that thought process, whether it's a real formal one or not. Transitioning to a more formal one, again, is what our recommendation would be. Valerie, Meredith, anything to add to that?
I would just say, just to reemphasize, when you embark on a mentoring program, making sure that you're setting those that are involved in it up for success. So the support and resources are really critical to be very mindful of and thoughtful of, and having a regular cadence and checking in. How's it going? And are we hitting the mark with the mentoring program? But I have run into organizations where they have a mentoring program and it's not getting the results that they want. And one of the key impact of that is because they haven't set the mentors up for success with clear objectives, clear responsibility, and support.
Thanks, you two. A participant wrote, at some point, Meredith mentioned something along the lines of building an effective development plan grows leadership accountability. And they asked if the team could develop more on that.
I'll jump in here, and then guys, please jump in as well. But I do think accountability is incredibly important as well. We talked early on that, you know, leaders and managers, particularly top leaders within organizations, are being held accountable for the cultures that they lead. You see all the time in the news about leaders that have resigned or been asked to resign because of toxic cultures that have been uncovered within their organization. So I do think that that's really important and this gets back to the actions that you develop to try to improve the culture and the governance that we mentioned, because actions by themselves without being executed and supported aren't going to be that useful to you. So when you have goals and activities that are being assigned or that leaders take on, leaders and managers, it's important that you adhere to those. Make sure that they're being delivered against, make sure that they're getting the right support to deliver against those actions, and hold people accountable when they're not, and reward and recognize when they are being delivered. So I think there's the other side of that coin. Both are incredibly important.
Along that vein, it gives you something to be accountable to. If you have a development plan in place, but with a development plan also comes support, right? So you not only have those goals, but if for whatever reason you're struggling to reach those goals, then you have the support of someone to come alongside of you and help look at potentially different ways to approach something, see if you potentially need some resources or if something needs to be adjusted. And a lot of the times that takes someone that may be one step ahead of you. So that's where that coaching really comes into play, or you know, it could also be that maybe you have a development plan or are asked to, as we were talking about, you're asked to come in and to be a change agent, and everything you're doing is countercultural. So making sure you have someone alongside of you that's coaching you through that process is very imperative and important.
I think the other piece to accountability is making sure that whether it's culture of 360 data, that it doesn't feel separate to the day-to-day work and what they're responsible for. So making sure that they are, you know, they're going to be much more accountable if, to Dave's point, they're measuring it and it's not just putting actions out there, but you're actually, you've got a measurement piece to it. But I think, you know, what I've seen help leaders be more accountable is when it really is, they see it in their day-to-day. Their development goals is helping them be more effective, getting the results that they're responsible for. So tying it back to their job.
Thank you all. I think we have time for a few more questions and then we'll close out. One of our participants asked, is it possible to apply this strategy to exiting leaders, or is it more advisable to focus on other leaders?
I'm a big fan of developing all leaders, whether you're staying within the organization or you're transitioning out. So we've got quite a few exercises, processes, methodologies around helping leaders through transitions, whether it's, you know, retirement or transition out to a different organization or transition into within an organization. So transitions is a big key element to that. And again, I'm a big fan of developing, even though you might lose the talent that you've developed. But
well, transitions impact culture. Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you think about the model, our model itself, in the adaptability section, that organizational learning is a big piece of our model. And so learning from leaders that are exiting the organization, I think are important to try to build on the strengths that you had, and also to shore up the areas that that leader may tell you were the sources of him or her leaving the organization. So I think learning is just an incredible piece as well.
Thank you all. Another participant wrote, should leadership assessments be tied to individual performance reviews?
Very,
No.
very interesting question.
Very specific.
Very, very interesting question. We recommend that the 360s be used for development. Now, having said that, and here's, I'll back up again. A couple of reasons behind that is we have seen that in some situations, behaviors can be changed by leaders trying to encourage their folks to give them higher scores. I think, you know, like one example that we've had, there was a campaign from one leader that went out to his or her direct report saying, strive for 5, you know, the 5 being the biggest score, the highest score you could give them on some of the assessments. And that behavior is absolutely not recommended. We don't recommend going out there and to try to influence folks to give you higher scores just so that it will have a favorable impact on your performance. Now, having said that, the areas that you need to develop should have actions associated with them. And if those actions are being measured about whether you delivered against those actions or not, and how you delivered against those actions, that could absolutely be used in your performance. Did you deliver against those or not? And that would be the recommendation for those reasons I just mentioned. Valerie or Meredith, anything to add to that?
No, I echo that. Nothing to add there. But you know, more and more, I think companies are struggling with that, and I think part of it is that accountability piece. And so thinking through accountability less on tying either culture data and or 360 data to a leader's performance from a compensation perspective is not the route to go to increase accountability, but infusing the accountability and, to Dave's point, in the performance conversation around evaluating, hey, how did you do on the actions that you tried to improve on based on your 360 or on the culture data?
Now, one comment to add to that is, if you think about the 360, one piece of the 360 is that individual's direct report, or that boss, the boss of that individual. So there shouldn't be any surprises from the boss's evaluation of that individual and the 360 from that boss as well. So those two should be pretty much in line. It's when you start getting some feedback from peers that may not have a whole lot of experiences with you and providing you with feedback, it is a bit shaky to include in a performance review.
Thank you all. I think that's probably all that we have time for right now. Just wanted to highlight some of our upcoming events and then thank everyone for joining. Our next webinar is scheduled for October 26th and will be around becoming an employer of choice. We'll send out a registration link in our follow-up. A few of you asked if the recording and deck would be shared with everyone, and the answer to that is yes. Our team will be following up in the next few days. And then we have some certification workshops. You'll see those dates listed there. In addition, our Latin American certification in Spanish is scheduled for late October and November. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining us and thank Dave, Meredith, and Valerie for your time and your insights. Any closing thoughts from you three before we thank everyone and say goodbye?
Just want to thank the audience. Great set of questions, and we look forward to hearing from you all, and we'll answer any other questions that we may not have gotten to. We'll make sure we get back to you on those.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, as Dave said, we'll be following up with those of you who we've been communicating with for follow-up and to answer those questions. But thank you all for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.